Hello, good evening. Tonight we're going to discuss a part of the world that we haven't discussed on this show before. This is the area known as the Balkans or the Balkans, whichever way you want to pronounce them, and which consists largely but not exclusively of the states which comprised the former Yugoslavia. This is a part of the world that I personally have visited many times, both when it was Yugoslavia and when it became post-Yugoslavia. And I'm very glad to have with me in the studio Igor Stix, who is a novelist and a playwright and an essayist and historian who is a researcher at the Edinburgh University and whose two most recent books are Welcome to the Desert of Post-Socialism, written with his colleague and comrade Srećko Horvat, and his latest book is A History of Yugoslavia, Nations and Citizens in Yugoslavia and the Post-Yugoslav States. Igor, let's start with you, because in these days of identity, everyone says, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this. Well, you are a Bosnian and a Croat. In essence, you're a pure Yugoslav, but we now have to describe you in different identities. So how would you do it?
Well, I was born in Sarajevo. I lived in Zagreb. I was a refugee in Croatia, and my parents come from Croatia. I lived there for like 10 years. Parents of my parents come from wider Central Europe, but most of the time now I spend in Belgrade, in Serbia. So you see, it was easier before. You could just say Yugoslav. Today it's much more complicated to define ourselves, unfortunately, mostly ethnically or religiously. But you know, if you would need a country to describe my origins, or at least what we know, it would need a country that doesn't exist. It's Austria-Hungary. If you were to describe origins of my son, you would need another country that doesn't exist, and it's Yugoslavia. So, but we are still there. We exist. We don't have problems with ourselves. It's usually that other people have problems by trying constantly to pigeonhole us. And this is something I think we should resist.
Igor, let's just go back a long way, because in order to imagine the new states that were created, apologists for what took place had to go back centuries in order to discover states or kingdoms which existed at the time to justify what is going on now. So in the case of Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, when could we say that they were actually ever independent entities?
If we can transpose the modern concept back into history, that will be the Middle Ages. But as we know, the Middle Ages had a different conception of identity, if you want, of what is state, what is kingdom, what is empire. And then in the Middle Ages, somewhere between the 9th, 10th century, all the way until the 15th century, you had the various states of the South Slavs. Be it Kingdom of Croatia, or Kingdom of Bosnia, or Kingdom and Empire of Serbia. They all existed at one point. And then for 500, 600 years, this region was mostly divided between Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire, and on the coast there was a Republic of Venice that controlled this area. So as you can see, people who wanted to create new nations in 19th century had to go back, really back, to imagine that past, that glorious medieval past. And as you can see, in 19th century, there was a clash of two conceptions. One was Yugoslav, later called Yugoslav. At that time, they called themselves Illyrians. They thought that they were ancient Illyrians, actually. And this is why Napoleon called this area Illyrian provinces. On the other hand, the Illyrians believed that all South Slavs are one nation, like different German tribes are just one German nation, and different parts of Italy just one Italian nation. On the other hand, there were people who believed that actually they are separate nations, mostly at that time thought of Croats and Serbs and Slovenes.
Let's come down now through the centuries. I mean, as you've said, two empires dominated this area and left their mark on it. We come to the subject of your latest book, Igor, which is 100 Years of Citizenship in Yugoslavia and the post-Yugoslav states. So the idea of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, because that's how they did it, came after the First World War when the Habsburgs and the Ottomans collapsed. Whose idea was it to make this a kingdom rather than a democracy, a republican state?
Well, those were the questions that were debated hotly at that time. Many people imagined Yugoslavia. Very often they were in the Habsburg lands, in Zagreb, imagining reunification of South Slavs under the Serbian crown. They were mimicking Italian reunification, of course, and or German reunification. And the war, First World War, brought different political realities to the fore. And therefore, they had an agreement that Yugoslavia will be united as the kingdom under the Serbian crown, but that it will be a federation. It turned out that after the establishment of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, as it was called back then, many hopes were betrayed. The kingdom remained unitary, and not as federal as mostly the Habsburg Yugoslavs hoped for, and that created a huge amount of conflict. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia, that was established immediately after the First World War, opted also for federal model, and they were clearly anti-monarchical. They performed extraordinarily well in the first elections that happened. They were the third major party. They won the position of the mayor of Belgrade. But the mayor of Belgrade at that time, elected communist mayor of Belgrade, did not want to give an oath in front of the king. And therefore, he was rejected as mayor, and very soon afterwards, Communist Party was banned.
How come the party was formed so quickly? There was a tradition then of radical politics in these regions during the empires.
Absolutely. There was a tradition of social democratic parties, and they were mostly collaborating with Austro-Marxists, and then within Gesamtpartei, or the common party they had in Austria-Hungary. On the other hand, a very strong tradition of social democracy developed in the Kingdom of Serbia. The Social Democratic Party of Serbia was the only one who rejected the war at the beginning of the First World War. So all these elements were present there. After the end of the First World War, and let's think about it, it was immediately after the October Revolution. There were various elements, anarchists, former soldiers, communist social democrats who came together in Belgrade and later on in the Slavonian town of Vukovar to establish the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Tito was not present there. He was then in Russia.
Tito was at the time in Russia?
Russia, yeah.
Doing what?
He was a soldier in Austrian-Hungarian army, and he was captured by Russia. He witnessed the October Revolution. He will later on come back to Yugoslavia, only to go again back to the Soviet Union, and came back unharmed after the Stalin purges to lead, at the end of the 30s, to lead the Communist Party of Yugoslavia.
It is quite an extraordinary history. You've, of course, left out what people in Western Europe go on about endlessly: assassination of Ferdinand in Sarajevo. The war was going to take place. If it had not been this provocation, there would have been some other. The imperial powers were poised for war, but that's what gave Sarajevo this sort of bad name, that this is where it happened. But even the terrorist group who carried out the assassination of the Archduke was a mixed group, which people really tend to forget these days.
It was a group called the Young Bosnia. It was a very mixed group. They want to fight for Yugoslav unification. They saw Austria as oppressor of their demands. There were also anarchic and socialist sentiments. And yes, they, among them, you can find the one who pulled the trigger, Gavrilo Princip, but also there was a future Nobel Prize winner in literature, Ivo Andrić.
I didn't know that. Ivo Andrić was a member of that group?
Member of Young Bosnia.
Amazing.
Yes.
And so the first Yugoslavia, Igor, effectively ruled by the Serbian kingdom and oligarchy, lasted till the Second World War. It broke up with the development of fascism in Germany, the entrance of the German armies into Yugoslavia. Could you tell us, please, what were the positions taken on the Second World War, because this affects the discussion today, and which part of the old Yugoslav society opted for backing the German fascists?
Today we have a lot of discussions about that because we are witnessing in almost all of these new states historical revisionism and also some sort of a neo-fascist nostalgia. It all has one common denominator, that's anti-communism. And anti-communism justifies absolutely everything. But if we go back into this very complex situation, we will see that the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia, defeated it in 11 days, and basically created a couple of entities. They divided Yugoslavia also between Italy, Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria. They established so-called independent state of Croatia that was independent only in the name. Under the Ustashi rule, which was the group sponsored and trained by the Nazis. They also established some sort of Vichy-like government in Serbia, and they occupied, clearly divided between Italian and German occupation zone. This was an imposition. This did not prevent some groups to form and some groups to carry out ethnic massacres and genocides, such as the Ustashis or the Chetnik groups in Serbia that formed first as some kind of a resistant group that later on started actively collaborating with Italians and the German occupying
There's no doubt about that at all.
There's absolutely no doubt about their collaboration. There's no doubt also about crimes they perpetrated in 41, 42,
This
and
was
43.
Mihailovic.
This is Mihailovic, yes. And they were staunchly anti-communist. So you got, on the one hand, in the so-called independent state of Croatia, genocide against Serbs and Jews and the Roma and everyone who opposed their policies. On the other hand, you got a number of Chetnik groups that were staunchly anti-Muslim, anti-Croat, and anti-communist. And within this group, within this situation of enormous crimes and massacres, there was only one force that resisted, and that was the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Basically, it was formed of all ethnic groups and started uprising already in 41 with some immense successes. They managed to liberate, those were the first liberated territories in occupied Europe in 41, not to mention by 43 they controlled significant parts of the country. So Tito established a very wide movement that was led by the Communist Party and was not per se communist. Instead, it was anti-fascist movement that he led to the victory in 1945.
It was probably one of the largest and most successful resistance movements in Europe against the Nazis.
Absolutely. We can find similar examples in Greece and to a certain extent in Italy, but this was the massive movement. When we talk about political communities, so the first Yugoslavia was destroyed. It ended in bloodshed. And they still had an idea to resurrect Yugoslavia and to establish it as a federal country that will finally solve the national question, meaning give nationhood to its constitutive nations, but also bring social justice. And this is how Tito won the war. His program was very simple: national liberation, solution to the national question, and socialism.
So then we have the establishment of the communist government in Yugoslavia, very popular at the beginning and very independent-minded, because what used to strike people at that time and even later in the 60s was that Yugoslavia didn't become like one of the Eastern European states, totally dominated by the Soviet bureaucracy, doing its bidding, the leaderships cloned by Moscow. Tito was never a clone. And fought back, and when threatened by Stalin, actually said that if you try to invade us, we will arm the population and then you'll see what happens. Try it. I mean, very defiant. And this gave him a prestige globally because this was unheard of in the communist movement.
Yes, these very dramatic events happened in 1948 when Tito defied Stalin and Stalin wanted to remove him. Tito resisted, won. Soviet Union accepted this after the death of Stalin and managed to secure Yugoslav independence or its special position between the two blocs. Tito knew how to navigate this. Nobody doubted that Tito should have defied Stalin, and he did. But on the other hand, the way he had to crash the rebellion of pro-Stalin forces was also brutal. Yeah. And this comes to the story of the Goli Otok, the Naked Island, where some 16,000 communists were imprisoned.
Supporters of
Stalin or accused to support Stalinism. Many people were completely innocent. But the fact that they had to put in jail their own comrades remained something that will haunt communist Yugoslavia until the very end.
What happened to them? Were many killed?
Some 400 died either from torture or natural causes and so on. This was not an extermination camp. They lived under harsh conditions there. When it was discovered, people usually talk about it a bit, but when it was discovered, it was also a big shock. So the victory over Stalin came with a price tag.
There was a price tag. Yeah. And were these prisoners released at some stage?
They were released after 3-4 years. Oh. Many of them came back and were reintegrated, so to speak. It's one of these things that are part of this story, of this history that we have to understand and critically examine as well.
Igor, now this is a big question. Why did Yugoslavia break up in the way it did? And was it stoppable?
Clearly, there were so many elements involved in this story that only to take one of them wouldn't do justice. But this is usually what academics do. There were clearly elements of economic crisis in the 80s. Yugoslavia, as in many other cases, was a precursor to some things we see today. It was under IMF-imposed austerity measures, even they called them austerity measures then, under the sort of restructuring and reform agreements.
Huge economic crisis.
Huge economic crisis in the 80s, which clearly allowed for the development of certain political agendas that were not compatible. That's one thing. On the other hand, at the end of the 80s, and with liberalization, certain political forces, nationalist political forces, who saw that there are some advantages in breaking up Yugoslavia. So I'm talking about local actors. This coincides with the rise of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, who opted for Serbian strong role within the Yugoslavia that clearly was met with a lot of resistance, especially from Slovenia. First democratic elections were, so to speak, very mismanaged. It happened separately in each republic, which created completely different political dynamic. It never happened at the federal level. We never had free multi-party elections at the federal level. So you can now already see the logic of fragmentation. Eventually, we ended up with 6 republics trying to figure out their way out of Yugoslavia, and with a very strong nationalistic rhetorics, especially in Croatia and Serbia. There were, of course, some international sponsors to all of this, picking sides. Unemployment was extraordinarily high. Communism was seen as defeated. Capitalism was seen as the only game in town. And it was important to have good starting position in grabbing all these resources. And I think without understanding that at this dimension, we cannot really understand.
But Igor, no, I think you're right on this. But one can't ignore the role played initially by the Germans. Oskar Lafontaine was very sharp. When he left the German Social Democratic Party, he said, and what we did in Yugoslavia is unforgivable, and the whole truth hasn't yet come out of the intervention, to try and accelerate Croatian independence at the very least, but behind the scenes also the Slovenian ones. Then the Russians started playing games with the Serbs, and finally the Americans came in to save Bosnia and are still there. And you feel today a terrible crisis, really. Rivers of blood almost dividing these nations. But then it began to slowly improve. But describe to me the role played by publications like that amazing satirical magazine that emerged in Zagreb called the Feral Tribune, which lampooned and attacked Milosevic and Tudjman. It didn't take sides.
Here is the answer to the question: was it stoppable? The breakup of course, it was one of the political scenarios that was definitely there on the table. And if had you asked people in '88, I would say, they would say, no, Yugoslavia will definitely survive. I mean, we are brothers, we're going to find some kind of solution to this. In '89, it started to look quite bad. In 1990, very difficult, not to mention when the first victims fell. And the effect of the crimes that were perpetrated by paid mercenaries and by paramilitaries, we know that, was tremendous. So that basically signified the end of Yugoslav dream in a sense, in fact that regardless whether we consider ourselves one nation or many nations, we should live together. After the first victims, this was not possible. But as you say, there were people who resisted, and resisted bravely, and fought for peace, either like people of Feral Tribune, very, very powerful satirical magazine in the 90s, strongly anti-nationalist, or like many people in Sarajevo in 99, just at the beginning of the war, 100,000 people were on the streets demanding peace. And then after they were shot at by snipers, it was the end of it. And here we can see this tragic story. There was a strong potential for peace, but couldn't find its political articulation. And this is what sealed the fate of Yugoslavia and sealed the fate of this region and the consequences of which we see until today.
And today now, Igor, when one visits the country or the different new states, you see the same situation in a much worse scale. Massive unemployment, small towns which used to have 2 factories which employed a bulk of the population. 1 factory closes down, half the population is out of work. Citizens of Sarajevo without any work at all, walking through the streets. It's a sort of depressing situation, and at the same time, as I never fail to tell people when I am there, the emergence of these corrupt elites who dress the same, talk the same, have the same body language, and want to make the same money from the same people, but occasionally they can't. So Croatia goes with its begging bowl to the EU, and the Serbs are now working with the Gulf states and crazy things. It's sort of, it's not so much the desert of post-socialism, which it is, it's also the desert of the surreal. You know, it's a awful situation.
In the book, we try to explain what happens in the desert of post-socialism, what happens once you destroyed what we used to call social ownership, and once you privatize it and destroy all industrial potential, what happened with the country where people died in such big numbers, but then also left the region, and huge number of refugees and people who are, as they call it today, economic migrants. So what happens when basically you just have an elite that is preying on this population, getting horribly enriched, closing all channels of political participation? So when you have a travesty of democracy and a brutal, really savage capitalism. Unfortunately, this is the desert we can see today in the region that is extraordinarily close to the West, that is now becoming more and more just a peripheral, where the only interest of the West is in its resources, and where it's important to keep in power a certain oligarchy, very criminalized oligarchy, in order to keep the peace and keep stability. So stability became the most important thing for the international community in the Balkans, not the improvement of the standards of people living there. So now imagine if in Germany, instead of the Marshall Plan, it was a savage capitalism imposed after the defeat of Germany. You wouldn't probably have German miracle. And this is exactly what happened after the war in this region. Instead of investing economically, we got this false humanitarian intervention that pretty much meant stop the war, and then start very harsh neoliberal measures. It really becomes surreal, but one of the first laws in a post-war Bosnia was the law on privatization. On the other hand, EU used to be, at least for the people in the Balkans, some kind of promise of stability or some kind of promise of prosperity. Now we have a very strange situation that half of the Balkans, and now here I'm talking not only about former Yugoslavia, has been already integrated in the EU. Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, and Slovenia. And there is a little ghetto of 6 states of less than 20 million inhabitants that are completely encircled by the EU states and also closed. People cannot really move freely. And the EU is still saying us that it can't really absorb that region. It can't really help it. And of course, in a typical neo-colonial fashion, puts all responsibility on the shoulder of these populations that stubbornly, as the narrative goes, refuse to vote some other people in the office who would then join the EU and successfully complete the integration process.
But one positive thing, Igor, I find, has been that over the last 20 years in particular, we've had the emergence of a new layer of young intellectuals like yourself and others all over the region who are writing incredibly sharply, whether it's plays or novels. You were involved in the Subversive Cinema Festival, which was set up in Zagreb. So that was something positive, combined with the big student uprising in Croatia, similar events happening in Serbia against destroying the architecture of the city, etc. So it's not completely lost. It is on the state level we've lost, but something is emerging again.
Absolutely. We have to give up on the Balkanisms that are constantly portraying this region as absolutely unruly and with no hope. Curiously enough, in this region, many radical movements formed and really experimented with horizontal democracy, with the new social movements to the extent we did not see in the so-called developed Western countries. Just mind that the student uprising in Croatia established this sort of a form of the plenum democracy of the citizens' assembly that then after that spread across the Balkans. And this happened in 2009, much before Occupy London or Occupy Wall Street. Think about that in 2014, only two years ago, in Bosnia, there was an explosion of the plenum movement when the protest movement moved into citizens' assembly in more than 20 cities. So you can imagine in Bosnia, the country destroyed by war, divided and ethnically divided, basically a protectorate of the West, where we have such an explosion of radicality and of the demand for social justice and a true democracy. So in this respect, the Balkans are not lagging behind, but actually very often are an avant-garde of the movements to come. And I think this is important that we shed light on these developments. Very strong intellectual scene, cultural scene, and the development of what I would call the new left. The new left that acts within their states, but also acts across the newly imposed borders, that is staunchly anti-nationalist, anti-fascist, that fights for participative democracy, and that also has very strong demands of social equality and justice. And I think that this is the movement that will give results. This is my hope in the future. We can already see some successes. The United Left Party in Slovenia entered the Slovenian parliament, has more than 10% and manages to play a role, a very important progressive role in Slovenia. Similar attempts did not work for now in other countries, but the fact that the new social movements are forming there where people would usually not look for them, it's very encouraging.
On that happy note, Igor, we will end this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.